one of the chapters in the book that leans on literary technique more than many of the others. The overarching theme of this chapter is transition and change. For many of us, periods of transition and change can be incredibly anxious for us. During these periods in our lives, the certainty of our daily routine has changed. The path we thought we might follow in life no longer exists, often leading us through new and unknown territory. We are deeply unsure of the future, and if you have made the decision of your own accord, you hope that you have made the right decision. It was these doubts and anxieties that I tried to reflect in this chapter as Meldrum begins his journey onwards to a new life in France. During this journey, Meldrum is not only driven by the need to leave his current position as a minister in Corstorphine, but is driven by the possibility of a better position in England, or so he thinks. However, the path upon which he treads takes a mysterious turn as he finds himself on a boat to France. At this stage in the journey, even Meldrum cannot comprehend his actions, but feels compelled to carry on as if he is aware that somewhere, somehow, and by somebody, he is being pushed towards a new life. Sometimes the fear of standing still and staying put is worse than what you will face in the future. Movement, particularly in a forward motion, can be important when weathering the storms of change. Meldrum's journey, which reflects the transitions of change, can be split into 4 stages. His sea journey from Leith to London, his brief stay in London, his eventful boat journey from London to the Isle of Jersey in the Channel Islands, and finally his journey to St Malo and onwards to Marly on the outskirts of Paris. Let's break down this journey in its stages and analyse each part. Leith to London. In this part of the journey, which starts at Leith, we are drawn to Meldrum's reflections on his childhood innocence as he played cudgels in the street with other children. Here Meldrum is looking back on happier and more carefree days as a child. Yet the mention of cudgels is significant because cudgels was a wooden stick or weapon. This is the first clue to Meldrum's former life, and that perhaps Leith was not a safe or trouble-free place, free from violence. Interestingly, Meldrum calls his ministry his first vocation, which we later discover is a complete lie, or perhaps a form of self-deflection, as he has an event which haunts him from his past. He confesses that his wish to become a minister also stemmed from his childhood, when he was invited by a soldier lay preacher from the occupying Cromwellian forces to a church service, which fired his passion, which turned into a vocation. Of course, this was unbeknown to his parents, and as presbyters, they were forbidden to associate with the Cromwellian forces by the Kirk. Back to 1672, Meldrum receives a letter instructing him to meet with the Archbishop of York for a transfer and promotion to the Church of England. Yet there is an air of mystery about the journey, as some of the details seem odd and do not seem to make any sense. Any contemporary reading this passage would question why Meldrum would be meeting with the Archbishop of York for the transfer, as this was usually handled by a bishop who had control over the diocese to whom the minister was to be appointed. Also, why is Meldrum being instructed to go to Lambeth Palace, the home of the Archbishop of Canterbury, when the Archbishop of York is based at York Minster? Meldrum himself knows that this is all very strange, especially his instructions to follow a backstory and burn his correspondence, but yet he still decides to follow his orders as they come from a senior member of the Church of England. Meldrum packs his bags, says goodbye to his brother, and embarks on the ship to London. The English ship upon which he embarks is heavy and slow. It also makes various stops upon its journey to London, loading on coal in Newcastle and herring at Yarmouth in Norfolk. Both these cargoes were commonplace in the sea routes of the eastern coasts of England. London at this time benefited significantly from coal from Newcastle. The herring fishing trade is a very old trade in the North Sea. Although dominated by the Dutch, the trade spanned from the Shetland Islands in the north to Great Yarmouth in Norfolk. There are also strange aspects to this sea journey which belie that there is something going on that Meldrum is not fully aware of. Firstly, Meldrum is sharing his dinner with the captain, which then, as today, is reserved for guests of honour. Why would a lowly parish minister be treated as a special guest by the captain? Secondly, a strange man boards the ship at Newcastle and tests Meldrum's patience and safety. So much so, Meldrum punches the drunk as an act of self-defence. Despite being a lowly cattle dealer, Davy, the man who boarded the ship, is also given a seat at the captain's table. This would have seemed extremely odd to contemporaries, leading to the suspicion that Davy is perhaps not who he says he is, or, as a cattle dealer, he has perhaps bought a place at the captain's table. Yet what we know about Meldrum's behaviour in this incident is that he managed to control his emotions and try to reason with the man before he asserted himself physically to protect both of them. It is also clear that Meldrum's approach is measured, as he wakes the assailant up with a jug of water after being knocked out. Nothing more is said, and Meldrum and the captain and Davy have dinner together. Let's explore Meldrum's time in London. Meldrum follows his instructions and takes a boat up the Thames to Lambeth Palace. He disembarks and is taken to a place called the Lollards' Prison for his meeting with the Archbishop of York. Yet this indicates that there is something strange going on, for surely the Archbishop would meet Meldrum in an office in the palace rather than a room used as a former prison. Instead of meeting the Archbishop of York, Meldrum is met with a grinning man with wild blonde curly hair, the complete opposite of what Meldrum was expecting. Instead of an interview for a new position in the Church of England, it turns into an interrogation as the mysterious man brings to light a terrible secret from Meldrum's past. After being confronted with this episode from his past, Meldrum is ordered to go back to the ship and continue his voyage onwards to Bordeaux. We know that during this interrogation, Meldrum was confronted by a news sheet about the incident from his past. That is all we know at this stage. Whatever Meldrum is confronted with, he decides to carry on his journey to France. Indeed, the fun part of writing this section was finding 17th century words and slang such as boyar, which means lout or oaf, but can also mean someone who practices archery and makes bows. In 17th century slang, mugwump means the man who remains aloof and independent. This is the first time that Meldrum unknowingly hears a reference to Lieutenant Colonel John Hamilton. Now we will explore Meldrum's journey from London to Jersey. Meldrum returns to the ship that sets sail onwards for Bordeaux. However, as the ship passes Deal in Kent and makes its way across the English Channel, it is hit by turbulent weather, and there are fears that they may be heading towards a deadly sandbank offshore, known as the Widowmaker. This sandbank was called the Widowmaker, otherwise known as Goodwin Sands, due to the number of deaths at sea that it caused. The inclusion of the Widowmaker in the narrative is again a literary device to highlight that there are still potential dangers as you embark upon a new path in life. For Meldrum, it is symbolic of the mysterious and troubled personal journey he has embarked upon. It is also important to acknowledge that whilst the ship was in immense danger, Meldrum has the presence of mind to look after the welfare of fellow passengers on the ship. We will return to this in another chapter of the audio guide. The ship is buffeted about for a few hours across the English Channel, but as the storm moves on, the crew and passengers find that the ship is not far away from the coast of the Isle of Jersey. This is symbolic of the crazy paving of life when we find ourselves in places or circumstances that we never expected to be in. The Channel Islands are self-governing islands comprising of Jersey, Guernsey, Alderney and Sark, and they are crown dependencies of the UK, and they lie 12 or so miles off the coast of France in the English Channel. Meldrum describes Jersey as a curious Anglo-French mix, with a French language known as Jarret, which is spoken on the island as well as English. He also notes that the buildings are of a French flavour. Clearly, this is to signify that Meldrum at this point, culturally speaking, is somewhere between Britain and France. It is at this crossing point between the two cultures that Meldrum has his doubts. Has he made the right decision to leave, especially when he is unaware of what is ahead of him? After a brief stay in St Helier, the captain decides to set sail for St Malo, just 12 miles from the Isle of Jersey. Now we will explore Meldrum's journey from St Malo to Marley. As St Malo comes into sight, and in particular he sees the town's high fortified walls, Meldrum is reminded of the old alliance between France and Scotland, as he notes that the walls were built to keep the English out should there be an invasion from across the English Channel. Here Meldrum feels a sense of familiarity and comfort in his new surroundings as he searches for and makes connections with the familiar and the known. Meldrum states that he is met off the boat at St Malo by a man that resembles an old cavalier, who takes care of Meldrum's belongings and puts him in the coach for the onward journey to Paris. This is the first time that readers are formally introduced to a member of La Garde Écossaise by the name of Peter Molyneux. It is here that Meldrum fully begins to realise that someone, somewhere, was looking after him during his journey from Leith to France. Meldrum reflects on the various points of his journey to Paris. Notably, they stop at an inn in Rennes, and Meldrum is immediately thrust into an atmosphere that he states that he has not been amongst for a long time. He is also confronted by the different social cues and expectations of this new country he has found himself in. Different social cues and expectations can be overlooked and underestimated when people immigrate to a new country. In Meldrum's case, this also includes a difference in moral standards, as reflected in the prostitute sitting on Meldrum's lap. We know at this point that Meldrum's parents were Covenanters, and as such, consorting with prostitutes, or even being in such an establishment as the inn at Rennes, was something to be frowned upon by the Scottish Kirk. We also get the impression that Meldrum is quite naive. Perhaps he led a sheltered life until that point. Another significant point in the journey is Gaston's attempted heist. Here Meldrum begins to discover who he is going to meet, and that this man is quite extraordinary. When Peter foils the heist by Gaston, he threatens to take him to see the lieutenant colonel. Gaston is terrified, on his knees and begging for forgiveness. Meldrum is taken aback by Gaston's extreme reaction, so much so that he concludes that the lieutenant colonel must be a truly terrifying figure.
This podcast is the copyright of History Gateway Limited, UK.